The morning Philippa Wentworth's entire life's work was placed under accusation, she was already at her table. The reference room of the Society for Natural Philosophy smelled of cold air and old paper, the tall windows letting in a January light so pale it barely reached the floor. And she had been there since the doors opened. Her manuscript pages arranged with the precision of someone who had learned, years ago, that disorder was the first thing used against a woman. She did not hear him approach. She felt the disruption before she identified its source, a shift in the room's quiet, the particular quality of attention that precedes an unwanted opinion. And then Dominic Ashford, Duke of Caldershot, leaned over her work as though it were a public notice posted for commentary, and read a passage she had written in the margins. He straightened. He looked at the page a moment longer, his expression entirely unimpressed. "I could have done better," he said. Philippa did not look up from the document she was currently annotating. "Good luck," she replied. She meant it precisely, not as dismissal, not as invitation, as a statement of fact. The work was hers. He was welcome to attempt something comparable. She returned her attention to the page. The two other scholars present in the reference room, Mr. Holt near the east window, and a visiting professor whose name Philippa had not yet learned, seated at the far end of the long table. Both went very still. The social friction was immediately legible to everyone in the room, not the ordinary friction of professional disagreement, but something older and more structured. Two forces that had been pressing against one another for long enough that the pressure had its own shape. Dominic Ashford did not leave. He moved to the shelves along the north wall, selected a volume with the ease of a man entirely familiar with the collection, and settled into the chair, 2 places from hers. He opened the volume. He did not speak again. This was, Philippa reflected, precisely the difficulty with Dominic Ashford. A man who argued was manageable, a man who simply remained, who occupied the same room with the quiet authority of someone who believed he had every right to be there, was another problem entirely. He was 42, with the kind of face that had grown more specific with age rather than less. He had been committee chair for the Society's endowment review for 6 years before resigning the position 18 months ago. And in those 6 years, he had managed to be technically correct about nearly everything while being personally intolerable on most occasions. That, at least, was Philippa's assessment. She was aware he might have a different one. She was 38, unmarried, and had spent 12 years publishing in a field that treated her publications as curiosities and her methodology as a subject for debate at dinners she was not invited to attend. The endowment she had built, the Wentworth Endowment for Natural Philosophy, established 3 years prior, was the first institutional mechanism in the Society's history to formally support the submission and review of scholarly work from women. She had funded it, structured it, and argued its legal framework before the governing board in a session that had lasted 4 hours and had required her to cite precedent 7 times before the chair stopped interrupting her. Dominic Ashford had been in that room. He had not interrupted her. She had not, at the time, known what to do with that. She was still uncertain. The clerk arrived at 10:30. He was a young man named Peters, apologetic by temperament, who navigated the reference room with the anxiety of someone perpetually afraid of disturbing something. He crossed to Philippa's table and placed a sealed letter beside her inkwell with a murmured apology for the intrusion. The seal was the Society's official wax, dark red pressed with the governing board's mark. Not a routine communication. Routine communications arrived through the post. Philippa picked it up. She looked at the seal. She set it down again and finished the annotation she had been making. because whatever the letter contained, the annotation was more important than her reaction to it. And she had learned to finish the sentence before opening anything that arrived sealed. Then she broke it and read. Her expression shifted. Something moved through it. Something that was not quite fear and not quite recognition, but contained elements of both. She read the letter twice. Then she folded it, placed it in her satchel, and returned to her manuscript page. Mr. Holt, near the east window, glanced up. The visiting professor did not. Dominic Ashford, 2 places away, turned a page in his volume. If he had noticed the letter's arrival or her response to it, he gave no indication. Philippa picked up her pen. She continued working. She stayed at the table for another hour and a half, annotating with the same precision she had brought to every page that morning. And the only sign that anything had changed was that she did not once look up at the window, as she usually did. When a cloud passed and the quality of the light altered, she did not read the letter in full until she was alone. She had taken a cab from the society to her rooms in Bloomsbury, removed her coat and hat without particular attention to where they landed, and sat at the table in her study, still in her gloves, which she registered only when she reached for the letter and had to pull them off first. The study was warm. The fire had been laid by her housekeeper before Philippa left that morning, and it had burned down 2 reliable coals. The lamp on the table was already lit. She unfolded the letter and read it from the beginning. It was a formal notice from the Society's governing board, 2 pages in the clerk's careful hand, attached to a sworn document of 3 additional pages. The notice informed her that a formal challenge to the foundational scholarship of the Wentworth Endowment had been received and entered into the board's record. The attached sworn document, signed under the name of Professor Arthur Stanhope, a senior fellow of some standing, alleged that the original scholarship upon which the endowment's legal claim rested had been derived, without attribution, from a suppressed submission made by a male scholar in the year prior to the endowment's establishment. The word used was plagiarized. The board had set a vote for 6 weeks hence to determine whether the endowment's charter should be dissolved on grounds of fraudulent foundation. Philippa set the letter down. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table. Then she opened her satchel and removed the counter records she carried with her as a matter of practice. She had carried them since the endowment's establishment, because she had known, in the abstract way one knows things one hopes will not happen, that a day like this was possible. The records contained the original submission dates for her foundational scholarship, certified by the Society's own registrar at the time of filing. She found the relevant pages and placed them beside Stanhope's sworn document. The dates did not match. Stanhope's document claimed the suppressed mail submission had been filed in March of the prior year. Her own certified records showed her foundational scholarship had been submitted to the Society in November of the year before that, 16 months earlier than the submission Stanhope was claiming she had plagiarized. The fraud was detectable. It was also, she recognized with the clarity of someone who had watched exactly this maneuver destroy her father, designed to be difficult to demonstrate. Detectable and demonstrable were not the same thing, and the board would not be interested in a verbal argument. She needed the original submission records from the Society's archive, the physical documents in their dated envelopes, with the registrar's marks intact. Without those, her certified copies were her word against Stanhope's sworn statement. She circled the date on Stanhope's document. She underlined his signature. Then she drew a line through his name at the top of the accusation. Not in anger, but in the specific way she crossed out hypotheses that required revision. The second letter was at the bottom of her satchel. She had known it was there since the Morning Post, and she had left it deliberately. Because the anonymous benefactor's letters required attention, she could not give them while sitting 2 places from Dominic Ashford in the reference room. The benefactor had been corresponding with her for 2 years. The letters arrived through a solicitor's forwarding address. Warm in register and precise in legal knowledge. Clearly familiar with the specific mechanisms of the society's governance in a way that suggested direct experience rather than research. She had never identified the author. She had tried twice and found nothing conclusive. The letters had funded the endowment's legal establishment costs at a moment when she had exhausted her own resources and had done so without conditions. This letter was shorter than most. The board's action is not unexpected, the benefactor had written. The accusation exists because someone wishes to close the vote before the membership has time to examine the evidence. You have grounds to contest, and the procedural window is available if you move within the week. The counter-petition mechanism under the Society's 1847 statutes has not been used in 20 years. But it remains valid. I have confirmed this. You know your own documentation better than anyone. Trust it. You have 6 weeks, and 6 weeks is enough. She read the letter twice, as she had read the formal notice. Then she set it beside the other pages on the table, and looked at all of it together. The accusation, the counter records, the benefactor's letter, and thought, with the particular discipline of a woman who had learned to think before she felt, about what needed to happen next. She reached for her pen. She began to write. The following morning, Philippa filed a formal counterpetition with the Society's registrar before the building was fully open. The registrar, a careful man named Aldous, who had worked at the Society for 30 years, accepted the document with an expression of someone who had been hoping his morning would be straightforward and was now revising that expectation. He stamped it. He entered it into the record. He told her she would receive written acknowledgement within 2 days. She thanked him and turned to leave. Dominic Ashford was standing in the corridor outside the registrar's office. He was not waiting exactly. He had the appearance of a man who had arrived with a purpose and happened to be pausing before executing it. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You've filed," he said. She met his eyes. "Yes," she said. "The accusation has a specific weakness," Dominic said. "The chain of custody for the sworn document. Stanhope's signature is dated the 14th, but the board's receipt is stamped the 12th. 2 days inverted. That breaks the evidentiary chain under the 1847 statutes, Clause 7. Philippa was quiet for a moment. She had not yet examined the chain of custody. She had been intending to. "How do you know the procedural language?" she said. It was not quite a question. Dominic did not answer it directly. He said, "I have access to the prior committee correspondence. The original submission records for the period in question are in those files. Without access to committee correspondence, you cannot reach the original records before the vote." "I am aware of that," Philippa said. "I am offering to share the access," he said. She looked at him for a moment, at the particular quality of his stillness, which was not the stillness of a man who was uncertain, but the stillness of a man who had already decided what he was going to say and was waiting for the conversation to arrive at it. "Why?" she said. "Because the accusation is false," he said, "and because the mechanism being used to advance it is one I recognize." She did not ask him to elaborate. She believed him, which was itself an inconvenient fact she set aside for later consideration. "I lead the investigation," she said. "You provide access to the correspondence files and nothing else. You do not interpret the documents, you do not direct the strategy, and you do not speak on my behalf to anyone at the Society without my knowledge. His answer came without hesitation. "Agreed," Dominic said. "Without warmth," she said, because she wanted it stated plainly. "I wasn't offering warmth," he said. "Good," she said. "Then we understand each other." She walked past him toward the stairs. He fell into step slightly behind her, which was the correct position for a man who had just accepted her conditions, and she noted that he had done so without argument. Over the following 2 weeks, they worked separately during the days and met each evening in her Bloomsbury study to compare findings. The arrangement was functional and remained so through an act of mutual discipline. Philippa spent her days in the Society's reading room, working through the endowment's original documentation and building the legal timeline. Dominic spent his days in the committee archive, extracting the prior correspondence that she could not access without his standing. Each evening, he arrived at 7 with documents under his arm, and each evening she had tea already made and her own pages already spread across the table. And they sat at opposite ends and worked. Their exchanges were structured arguments. She challenged his interpretation of a statute governing submission review. He was reading the clause as permissive. She read it as mandatory, and she was right. And she cited the 1851 amendment that confirmed it. He accepted the correction without particular grace and moved to the next document. He corrected her dating of a secondary letter from the committee secretary. She had placed it in April. He had the envelope in hand with the postmark clearly showing March. And she revised her timeline without comment, because the date was the date and her preference was irrelevant. She was right about the statute, and she admitted nothing additional. On the 4th evening, he brought a second lamp from the hall without asking, placing it at her end of the table where she had been working in inadequate light for 3 evenings running. She did not thank him. She moved the lamp to the precise position that served her best and returned to the page. The pattern that was emerging from Stanhope's correspondence with the board was not what either of them had expected. They had entered the investigation expecting to find a straightforward falsification, a document prepared to serve Stanhope's interest in discrediting the endowment. What they found instead, spread across 6 years of committee letters, was a record of systematic suppression. 3 women scholars, before Philippa, had submitted foundational work to the Society and received formal rejections citing procedural deficiency. 2 of those rejections had been accompanied by quiet accusations of derivation. Never sworn, never entered into the formal record, but communicated in letters between committee members that had remained in the archive uncatalogued. The suppression of claims was older and wider than the endowment alone. "This is not about me specifically," Philippa said one evening, setting down a letter she had been reading. "No," Dominic agreed, without looking up from his own page. "Someone has been doing this for a decade," she said. "At minimum." "The earliest letter I have found is from 9 years ago," he said. "But the pattern in the language suggests it was already established by then." She looked at the documents spread between them. Her pages and his pages. The accumulated evidence of a campaign she had walked into without knowing it existed. She thought about her father. She did not say so yet. One evening, she reached across the table to indicate a line in the document he was reading, a specific phrase in a committee letter that she recognized from an earlier document, the same wording used twice in different years, which suggested a template rather than an original composition. Her hand came to rest on the page beside his as she pointed to the relevant passage, and neither of them moved immediately. He read the line she was indicating. She became aware of the precise distance between her hand and his, which was not a large distance, and withdrew her hand and then returned to her own end of the table. He noted the passage. The work continued. The session on the 12th evening ran past midnight. The accumulated correspondence had yielded a new thread, a series of letters between the committee chair and a senior board member that predated the endowment's establishment by 2 years. And neither of them had been willing to stop, while the thread remained unresolved. By the time the letters were sorted and catalogued, the fire had burned low, and the street outside the study window was entirely silent. Philippa set down the last letter and pushed back from the table. "I need air," she said. She went downstairs and opened the front door. The street was narrow, as Bloomsbury streets were, and it was raining. A cold, steady January rain that had apparently been falling for some time without her noticing. She stood in the doorway and breathed the cold air and looked at the wet pavement and the dark windows of the houses opposite. She heard Dominic on the stairs behind her. He came to stand beside her in the doorway, and then, without commentary, removed his coat and placed it over her shoulders. She had not asked for it. She did not remove it. They stood in the narrow doorway, with the rain falling past them into the street. "My father was a natural philosopher," she said. "He spent 11 years on a study of mineral composition in the northern coal fields. He presented the findings to the Royal Institution in 1863. 6 months later, a formal accusation was filed by a fellow of the institution, a man who had attended the presentation, who had asked questions about the methodology, who had received copies of 2 preliminary papers." She paused. "The accusation alleged that my father's methodology was derived, without attribution, from unpublished work by a senior fellow." The rain fell. Dominic did not offer sympathy. He said, "Who handled the original filing?" "A committee chair named Griffiths," she said. "He managed the inquiry. He was careful about it, thorough. The accusation was upheld." She looked at the rain. "My father spent the last 4 years of his life attempting to restore his standing. He did not succeed." Dominic was quiet for a moment. "Griffiths reported to Lord Trevane," he said. Philippa turned to look at him. Trevane was the senior board member who appointed the inquiry committee in 1863. Dominic said, "I have the appointment record and the correspondence files." The rain fell between them and the street. Philippa looked at the wet pavement, then at the door behind them, then at nothing in particular, while she held that information still and let it settle into the shape it required. "Come inside," she said. They went back up the stairs. She hung his coat on the back of the door without thinking about it, and they returned to the table. And neither of them spoke again about her father. But the thread they had been following through the committee correspondence looked different now, not wider, but deeper. And they worked until 2 in the morning before the shape of it became clear enough to stop. Late on the 15th evening, Dominic placed a certified copy of the fraudulent document beside a letter from Trevane's secretary that Philippa had retrieved from the Society's own archive 3 days earlier. He set them parallel under the lamp and looked at them for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "Come here." She crossed to his end of the table. He did not point immediately. He let her look. The handwriting of the fraudulent document, the body of it, not Stanhope's signature, matched the handwriting of the secretary's letter. Not closely, identically. The particular formation of the letter D, the way the T-crossings angled upward to the right, the compressed spacing between words that the writer used when moving quickly. It was the same hand. "It isn't Stanhope," Dominic said. "It's Trevane." Philippa picked up both pages and carried them to the window where the lamp gave the strongest light. She held them side by side and examined them for 90 seconds, which was long enough to be certain. Stanhope signed it, she said, but he didn't write it. He was used. His voice was even. Yes, Dominic said. She set the pages down on the windowsill and looked at the rain on the glass. Every plan we have built targets the wrong man, she said. We have 3 weeks remaining. We do, he said. She turned back to the table. Stanhope is now a witness, not the adversary. She began moving pages, her pages, his pages, the correspondence files, the certified copies, clearing the table back to its surface. We start from the first document, he said. Together, then. She looked at him across the cleared table. Together, she said, and pulled the first document toward her. She went to Stanhope the following morning. He received her in his rooms at the Society with the expression of a man who had been expecting a visit and had not slept well in anticipation of it. He was older than she had imagined from his correspondence, closer to 60 than 50, with the careful posture of someone who had spent a lifetime managing his position and was now aware that the management had failed. She placed the 2 documents on the table between them without preamble. The fraudulent accusation beside the secretary's letter. I need you to look at these, she said. He looked. He was quiet for a long time. Trevaine's secretary brought the document to me, he said finally. He told me it was a formality, that the board required a senior fellow's signature to enter a procedural challenge, and that the challenge itself was already supported by the necessary evidence. He paused. I read it. I knew it was. I had concerns. But Trevaine's standing is considerable, and I was told the alternative submission records had already been reviewed. They had not been, Philippa said. No, Stanhope said. I understand that now. I need a sworn statement, she said, confirming that Trevaine's secretary delivered the document and instructed you to sign, confirming that you were not provided with the submission records, confirming the date the document was brought to you. Stanhope looked at the documents on the table. He looked at her. He will not forgive it, he said. Her answer was direct. No, she said. He won't. Stanhope was quiet for another moment. Then he said, I'll have the statement prepared by this afternoon. She thanked him and left. She was halfway back to Bloomsbury when the message from the Society's registrar reached her, delivered by a clerk who had been sent to find her at her study and had been redirected to the street. The registrar's note was brief. Lord Trevane had moved that morning to suspend Philippa's access to the Society's archive pending the board vote, on grounds that an active petitioner had a conflict of interest in accessing institutional records. The suspension was to take effect the following day unless successfully contested. Without the archive access, she could not present the original submission records at the assembly. Without the original submission records, Stanhope's statement was supporting evidence without a foundation. She read the note standing on the pavement in the cold. Then she walked to Dominic's townhouse on Bedford Square, which she had never done before, and knocked. He opened the door himself, which suggested he had been near it. He read her expression before she spoke. Trevane has moved to suspend my archive access, she said. Effective tomorrow. I know, he said. Come in. He had already drafted the counter-motion. It was on the desk in his study, a formal invocation of a former committee chair's standing to block the suspension for a period of 10 days, pending the Assembly's determination. He handed it to her, and she read it while he explained the procedural basis. This requires a former committee chair's standing, she said. Not just any member. Yes, he said. She looked up from the document. How did you obtain it? He met her eyes directly. I was the committee chair, he said. 2 years ago, before the endowment was established. I held the nomination for the position you now hold." He paused, and then said the rest of it plainly, as though it were a fact to be recorded and not a confession to be made. "I declined the nomination and redirected the associated funds to establish the endowment under your name. The benefactor correspondence you have been receiving. That was through my solicitor's office." The room was very quiet. Philippa stood with the counter motion in her hand and looked at him. She thought about the letters, 2 years of letters, warm and precise, familiar with her methods in a way she had never been able to explain. She thought about the legal establishment costs she had not been able to cover. She thought about the phrase, "You know your own documentation better than anyone," which she had read a dozen times and which was, she now understood, the particular way Dominic Ashford paid attention, not as commentary, but as observation, careful and specific and entirely his own. "Dominic," she said, just his name. Once. He did not explain further. He did not offer the speech she could see he had prepared and then decided against. He simply waited. She crossed the room and kissed him. It was a deliberate movement. She made the decision and then carried it out. And there was nothing impulsive in it except the certainty, which had been building for weeks without her permission. He returned it with equal deliberateness, one hand at her shoulder, and when they separated, she was still holding the counter motion. She looked down at it. "The 10-day window," she said. "Is it firm?" "It is," he said. "Then we have work to do," she said, and returned to the table. The Society's formal hall held 40 seats for members and a raised platform for the chair and the board. Every seat was occupied when Philippa entered on the morning of the assembly. The hall smelled of wood polish and coal smoke and the particular staleness of a room that had contained institutional authority for a long time. Trevane was already at the board table, a man of 65, with the deliberate composure of someone who had never, in his career, lost a vote he had arranged in advance. He did not look at Philippa when she entered. Dominic was seated in the former committee chair's gallery to the left of the platform, which was his right by standing and which placed him exactly where he needed to be. The chair called the session to order. Trevane rose immediately. He was smooth about it, the motion of a man who understood procedural rhythm and moved inside it like water inside a channel. He stated that the board had received a formal challenge to the Wentworth Endowment's foundational scholarship. He stated that the challenge had been sworn and properly entered. He moved that the board proceed directly to the vote to dissolve the endowment on grounds of fraudulent foundation, as the evidence before them was sufficient and the matter had been under consideration for the requisite period. 3 board members nodded. 2 did not move. Philippa rose. "I object to proceeding to a vote before the documentation, before this assembly has been entered into the record," she said. Her voice was level and carried to the back of the hall without effort. "These documents establish the origin of the fraud, not the fraud alleged against the endowment, but the fraud contained within the accusation itself. I move that they be examined before any vote is taken." She placed the documents on the table before the chair, the handwriting comparison, with a written analysis prepared by a document examiner she had engaged through Dominic's solicitor, Stanhope's sworn statement, attested and sealed, and the chain of custody record demonstrating the 2-day inversion in the accusation's dates, with the relevant clause from the 1847 statutes cited in full. Dominic rose from the former committee chair's gallery. "As former committee chair, I formally move that the documents presented by Miss Wentworth be entered into the assembly record before any vote is taken," he said. Under the Society's governing statutes, the assembly chair has no procedural basis to refuse this motion. The chair looked at his statutes. He looked at the motion. He looked at Trevane. Trevane said. I object. The documents have not been reviewed by the board in advance of the session, and their provenance is unknown. The objection is overruled, the chair said. And Philippa heard something settle in the room. A shift in the quality of the air, the way a room sounds when a decision has been made that cannot be unmade. The documents are entered into the record. The board will examine them before any vote proceeds. The hall was quiet while the board members read. Philippa stood at the table and did not sit down. She watched the board members' faces as they moved through the handwriting comparison. The careful notation of the D formations, the T crossings, the compressed word spacing. She watched the moment when the second board member reached the document examiner's conclusion and set the page down and looked at Trevane with an expression that contained no warmth whatsoever. Stanhope rose from the members' gallery. I will confirm my statement verbally, he said. Trevane's secretary brought the document to my rooms on the afternoon of the 13th. I was told the submission records had been reviewed and that my signature was a procedural formality. I was not provided with the submission records. I signed in error and under a misapprehension that was deliberately created. He paused. I regret it. The hall absorbed this in silence. The vote to dissolve the endowment was called. It failed. 3 in favor, 9 against, with 2 abstentions. The margin was not close. A board member Philippa had never met, a woman named Hartley, seated at the far end of the board table, who had not spoken during the session until this moment, raised her hand. I move that the Assembly confirm the Wentworth Endowment's legal standing and transfer its administrative control fully and permanently to its founder, she said. On grounds that the foundational scholarship is documented, the challenge has been demonstrated to be fraudulent in origin, and the endowment's continued independence serves the Society's stated purpose. The motion was seconded immediately. It carried 11 in favor, 1 abstention, none against. Trevane did not speak. He gathered his papers from the board table with the deliberate movements of a man concentrating on not revealing anything, and he left the hall before the chair closed the session. The door did not close loudly. It simply closed, and he was gone, and the room continued without him. That evening, Philippa returned to her Bloomsbury study. The table still held the working documents from the final night of preparation, pages in her hand and pages in his, the correspondence files they had catalogued together, the draft of the legal timeline she had written while he read through the archive letters beside her. She had not cleared any of it. She had not had time, and beyond that, she had not wanted to. Not yet. Not while the shape of the work was still present in the room. She made tea. She sat in her chair. She looked at the table and the lamp and the rain beginning again against the window. And she thought about her father, who had spent 4 years trying to restore what one afternoon in a committee room had taken from him, and who had not succeeded. She thought about the 11 votes. Dominic arrived an hour later. He knocked, which he had not always done in the weeks of the investigation, and she said, "Come in," and he entered and closed the door, and stood for a moment looking at the table with its accumulated pages. She set a cup of tea beside his customary place at the table without ceremony, and returned to her chair. He sat down. He picked up the nearest letter from the correspondence files, one that still required a written response, and began to read it. She opened the endowment's record book and turned to the first blank page. She picked up her pen and began to draft the first official letter under the endowment's confirmed legal standing. A letter to the 3 women scholars whose foundational submissions had been suppressed in the years before the endowment existed. informing them that a formal review mechanism was now available, and that their prior submissions could be re-examined under proper procedure. She wrote for a while. He worked through the correspondence. The fire settled into its coals, and the rain moved steadily against the glass. "Listen to this," she said, and read aloud the passage she had drafted regarding the review mechanism. The specific phrasing she had chosen to describe the process, without making it sound like a concession or a remedy, but simply like a door that was now open. He listened. He said, the second sentence, "May submit is weaker than are invited to submit." The distinction matters to someone who has been told their work was not wanted. She looked at the sentence. He was right. She made the change. She returned to the letter. He returned to the correspondence. The lamp burned on the table between them, warm and steady, and the rain continued against the window, and neither of them moved to leave. At some point, he refilled his own tea from the pot she had left on the side table, and when he passed her end of the table, he refilled hers as well. And she said nothing, and continued writing. And the study held them both in the particular silence of people who have run out of reasons to be anywhere else. The letter was finished before midnight. She set it aside to be copied in the morning and opened the endowment's record book to the next page, where the administrative correspondence still requiring answers was listed in her own hand. Dominic reached across the table and turned the record book toward himself to read the list. He selected 3 items from it and drew a line beside each. His indication, she had learned weeks ago, that he intended to handle them. She turned the book back toward herself and looked at his marks. "The third one is mine," she said. "I know," he said. "But I have the contact at Lincoln's Inn, and you don't." She looked at him steadily for a moment. "Fine," she said. "The third one is yours." He turned back to the correspondence. She turned back to the record book. The rain fell against the glass, and the lamp burned between them, and the evening continued, unhurried, into the hours that were nobody's business but their own.